Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Berger about how ranchers can most effectively utilize ranch profits. Aaron gets to see and work with a lot of different ranchers and is a wealth of knowledge to the ranching community. I think you'll really get a lot of value out of what he has to share today, whether we are talking about investing back into the people on your operation, the operation itself, you, or preparing for retirement. But with that, let's learn how we can make the most of these good years on the ranch. Grazing without limits and ranching without boundaries. Unlock the full potential of every acre with SenseHub Fence, the smarter way to manage your cattle herd. Cut costs, conserve resources, control grazing across even the toughest terrain with virtual fencing that combines real-time herd data with powerful hands-off precision. Profit, sustainability, and efficiency, all in one system. SenseHub Vents puts smarter grazing at your fingertips, saving you time, effort, and money compared to traditional fencing. Ready to transform your ranch? Learn more at ventsfence.com, and that link is in the show notes. All right, Aaron, well, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. I always enjoy having other podcasters on here too, so I'm excited to talk about ranch profits and specifically what ranchers can do with their ranch profits. I mean, looking at some of the best practices for where to put those, how to spend those, or save those, whatever it may be. So before we get started, to help the listeners get in a little bit of a better idea for who you are, if they aren't already familiar, can you share why you bet on the beef industry?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I bet on the beef industry because I like beef, right? So we eat a lot of beef at my house, but that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek answer. But I grew up on a ranch, grew up on a seed stock operation, had the opportunity to work in a feed yard, managed a ranch in Colorado before I came and took this job. During this job, my wife and I ran an operation. We had cow, calf, stocker, yearling, and I love the beef industry. I love working with beef cattle. I love managing grass. And to me, there's probably one of my favorite days is working cattle on green grass. That's something I enjoy. So I think the beef industry has a bright future from my perspective. It's been really encouraging to me to see demand continue to be very strong in the face of some excellent prices. And I've had some conversations with folks recently who have made diet changes, and protein, in particular beef, is a major part of what they enjoy. So I think we have a lot of opportunity ahead, and I think we are in a great position as far as having a quality product that people want. And I'm pretty bullish on where we're at right now.
I was actually at a steak judging contest about a year ago, and it was all carnivore focused. So there were a bunch of people there on the carnivore diet. So it was really cool to see how excited they were about beef and how that is what they survive on.
Yeah, the other thing I think is really encouraging to me is it's been a long time in the making. The University of Nebraska has been part of this, but how a lot of these lower value cuts are now having tremendous value in the marketplace. Things that at one point were almost being given away and now are really leading in terms of demand. Things like a brisket or, flank steak or some of those things that people really found good ways to cook. And there's just a lot of demand. I think the other thing that's really interesting to me is how much demand there is in the meat case for grilling at home. I think the whole COVID event, there's a generation that figured out, hey, this is something I can do at home. They enjoy doing it. They do it with their friends via technology, right? They may not be right by the grill, but they're interacting over that. And so I think there's some social aspects to this as well that are really driving people's enjoyment of the product we produce.
So Aaron, when we were talking about what to discuss, you are someone who I could talk to you on the podcast about 100 different things. So you're the one who kind of threw out this topic of how ranchers can best utilize their profits. And why was that something that you want to talk about or that you think is important to bring up during this time period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we think about profits for ranchers, profitability is not something we often think about in the cow-calf industry anyway, or we think about it, but we're not challenged with, I've got some really good income this year. For most cow-calf producers, 2 out of 10 years, what I would say are really good years. And then we have 4 or 5 that are kind of fair. And then there's, 4 to 5 that are kind of challenging years, really financially. We're in a season now where I think many cow-calf producers are going to have some profitability. And I recognize there are some folks that that's not the case. They've had some challenging years. They're trying to heal up financially. And then there's some folks that are in just reduced inventories because of the drought. They've got less cattle in inventory. And so, they're trying to rebuild their herd. But for some folks, they're going to have some profits. And as they think about profits, one of the temptations sometimes is they'll go to their accountant. And I hear this frequently. They're charging their accountant. The charge to the accountant is, I don't want to pay taxes. And so the accountant says, well, then you need to buy something. You need to buy some equipment. You need to buy some cows. And those may be good business decisions. And so if that's a strategy that's been thought through, there's a piece of equipment that you really need. It's going to add value to the business. Maybe there's a need. You've got plenty of forage available. So adding some cows is a good plan. It's not going to increase your overhead costs. There's some strategies where buying something probably makes sense. But the other thing I'd encourage folks is maybe step back a little bit and just think more strategically about your enterprises, your business, and what could you do with profits. And so one of the first things I think is go having a conversation with your accountant now and your banker and just talk through what's the year looking like. If prices stay where they are and we sell calves or we sell yearlings as we normally do, and we're looking at our expense side, where are we going to be sitting? How are things going to look? That just gives you some time to begin to think about what are some options of some things we might do in terms of making investments. And I think there's a lot of things to make investments in. One of the things I encourage people to invest in is themselves and the people that work for them or work with them. We've had some challenging years in the business, and celebrating people, rewarding people, taking a trip, going and getting an educational experience that maybe you wouldn't normally do, go touring some other operations, making some investments in the people. Maybe it's taking a class. Maybe it's an estate plan that you've been thinking, we really need to get on this, but we don't have the capital to go do that right now. This would be a great time to go invest in that. And so those are things, kind of some soft things, I would say, the people side, something I'd really encourage folks to consider and think about.
Okay. So, before we dive into a few more buckets or categories per se of where ranchers could put some income, I want to talk a little bit more about how maybe sometimes profits can be misused. And you brought up, sometimes at the end of the year, you go to your accountant and it's like, I don't want to pay taxes. So then it's okay, spend X amount of dollars. And depending on what that is, that can really put you in a sticky situation. So are there other examples of where you maybe see sometimes profits being misused by ranchers, or maybe not misused, but maybe not allocated in the best place that's going to set them up for years to come?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think so many times ranchers are trying to figure out how to be profitable. Just they don't know what to do with profits. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. We don't think we should be here, or we're not comfortable being here. And so there's a decision that's made that doesn't really maybe drive them towards their goals long term. And it's almost, as you said, like a knee-jerk reaction. So, I think some other things I just encourage folks, thinking about, are you in a situation where your record keeping plans and things, are you set up to really understand what's happening with your business, what's happening with your cow herd or your stock or yearling enterprise? If that's another place where you're feeling like I'm making decisions, but I'm not really sure I've got all the information I need, that's another example where I think this is a great year to maybe think about, could you hire someone else part-time to do some bookkeeping? For most farmers and ranchers, record keeping, the finances, the cash flows, some of that is just not their skill set that they enjoy. They do it late at night. How do we get this together? And so they're trying to make decisions and they think they kind of know where they're at. But, it's interesting. Any other business, they try to find the best people they can to help them with the things they're not good at. It's how do I hire somebody better than I am to do the thing that I'm not very good at? And so I think that's something I'd encourage folks to think about too. There's some folks out there that maybe in your community that you could hire to do some of the things that you really don't like, that maybe aren't really your strong suit, but then could provide you the information you need to make effective decisions. So, maybe that's some record keeping, maybe that's just some financial management things, just keeping up on regular bills and, those kind of things that someone else could do for you. And I had the opportunity to work with an individual that did that for a number of ranches. And I'm convinced that both he and they both benefited greatly by his involvement with them, saying, hey, here's what's going on. Here's where you're at in terms of your cash flow. Here's where your thing's at with the bank. Here's what we would normally see in terms of income and expenses. Let's talk through, what are some options. Look for partnerships that can provide that opportunity.
Awesome. Okay, so you already, when we're looking at different ways to put those profits and feel good about where we're putting them, you already brought up investing in people, rewarding yourself, rewarding your family, rewarding your employees in a variety of ways. What other categories do you think ranchers should consider?
Yeah, so I think after the people part and some of these soft things we've talked about, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and just think about your own retirement and think about ways you might use profits, not only for retirement, but to give you some access to some capital. So there's some different vehicles out there, whether those are retirement accounts, whether that's a traditional IRA, or if you're a small operation where maybe it's just you and a spouse, something like an individual 401k or one participant 401k. Those are very interesting tools in my mind to be able to manage income in years like this, where you can take a reduction in your taxes. You'll still have to pay self-employment tax on that, but federal state income tax will not be paid. And something like the individual 401k, depending on the provider of that, you can actually go back and then borrow from that up to half of the money you invest. So let's say you had a really windfall year this year, and maybe you made $500 per cow, and you've got more money than you normally would, and you're in a higher tax bracket than you normally would be. Maybe take a chunk of that money and look at considering investing it in something like a 401k, where you can borrow from that, but also then down the road, as you think about maybe transitioning that business to the next generation, oftentimes we've got all of our capital tied up in hard assets like land and cattle and equipment, and don't have much in terms of cash. And so now we've got a generation that's ready to transition out. They want to pass on that operation to the next generation. They're asset rich, but cash poor. And so having some money in a 401k, something like that, to provide some outside income. The other thing is a lot of farmers and ranchers don't have much in terms of Social Security because they've tied everything back to that operation. They've plowed their profits back to that. And so I think just recognizing what could you do with that. So really would encourage folks, consider investing in a retirement account. Look at these individual 401ks if you're a smaller operation. Understand what they can do for you, because there's some really neat things out there, I think, that many in ag don't consider as far as some retirement account options. That's something I think could be used for this year with profits.
And I think a lot of that goes back to finding the right financial advisor or professional who can introduce you to those options, because I know last year my husband and I were just talking with ours about, okay, what maybe could we do? And it was almost overwhelming, the amount of ideas and places we could put stuff. But fortunately, when you work with someone, they can say, here's where you're at, here's maybe where we start, etc.
Yeah. Find an expert, find somebody really good that can help you. And then this is, if there's an overarching theme from today, I want to have folks take home, don't wait to be thinking about this. Because what often happens is that all of a sudden we're to December 15th, and now there's a scramble to be thinking about what are we going to do, because we need to get something done before year end or something like that, whether that's buying equipment or, making an investment in something. Think about it now. Doing some prep now gives you some time to think through things and make some decisions and not have them be done in a hurried manner.
All right. So you've talked retirement planning, some of the soft stuff. What other categories come to mind that ranchers can think about?
Yeah, so let's kind of shift gears now and talk about what I would call more hard type investments, physical things. One of the major things I see is a great opportunity for folks to invest in is water development. From my perspective, the business of ranching is harvesting forage with livestock. And one of the critical things to be able to harvest forage effectively, manage it effectively, is to have good supplies of water. So depending on where you're at, that can look very differently. I know you've got listeners all over the United States. So if you're in the Southeast, maybe it's some ponds and dams need rebuilt, some springs developed. If you're in the western part of the United States, we're looking at pipelines and wells and things like that. But water development, as I work with ranches, frequently is their first limiting thing as they think about trying to improve their grazing management. And so I'd really look at, is there an opportunity for us to do something with water development? Along with that, I would say are what I would call water monitoring technologies. Over the last decade, Shaye, there's been some amazing developments in the technology that's out there to monitor water. And I don't know about you, but frequently growing up, I grew up in a ranch where we were checking windmills every day or every other day because, we were dependent on the wind to blow. And if the pitman stick broke or, pipe came off, the cattle were out of water. So you spent a lot of time going to check water where 99% of the time there was never an issue. But if there was an issue and you didn't know about it, it was disastrous. And so there's some water monitoring technology out there that I'd really encourage folks to look at, whether that's remote cameras, pipeline sensors, tank monitors, things that you can look at your phone and know, is everything good with the water? Now, that doesn't mean you don't need to go check cows, right? But it just gives you a lot of freedom, gives you a instantaneous knowledge if a well went down or if a pipeline loses pressure or pitman stick broke on a windmill, right away. And so I think there's tremendous value in that. Would really encourage folks to look at that technology. Some other things I really think are pretty important is looking at some of the technology that's out there for fencing right now. We are pretty familiar with some of these electric fence, temporary electric fence. That's another tool that has, I think, a lot of value for capturing forage, utilizing it effectively, efficiently. One of these technologies that's really got my attention that I think is going to become more and more interesting is virtual fence. The last 2 to 3 years, I'm starting to see some ranchers who, what I'd say are early adopters, starting to get into this. They're learning some lessons, figuring some things out. But I'm seeing some folks that are saying, you know what, I think this could be a game changer. I really think this can make a huge difference for us. So again, this is going to be situationally dependent. For some folks, it doesn't have any application. For others, could have a lot of application. So that's again where I think maybe we look at going and buying some of this technology this year if we've got some extra money, trying it out on a group of cattle, seeing does it work, do we like it, what could it do for us, trying something out like that to see if it has some potential.
I'm glad you brought up all of that because on the infrastructure standpoint, I don't think I've ever talked to a rancher who hasn't wanted at least, one more well or water source or something like that to create more flexibility with how they're grazing, or even perimeter fence. I don't think I know anyone who's completely satisfied with the perimeter fences that they have set up. I know we sure are looking at how do we get someone in to build new fence, or, it doesn't seem like we'll ever have time to do it ourselves, but do stuff like that. But then on the technology front, there is so many cool things, whether that's the water monitoring systems, the virtual fence, cattle wearables, there's a lot coming or available on the genomic testing standpoint too. So yeah, there's a lot that ranchers can play with and have fun with and improve their operations at the same time.
Yeah. Another one that I think, and this is kind of I think it's just one we got to increasingly be aware of, is just, what's your dependency on the electric system and do you have a backup? And I think I really encourage folks, again, if you've got water that you're dependent on, electricity to pump water, run some fundamental things to provide water, what's your electricity backup situation? And do you have a good generator situation? Do you have a good backup for that? I don't know what the future holds, but it seems like things are more and more tenuous at times. And, if you were without water or without electricity for a week, what would that do to your operation? Could you function? Are you set up to handle that? So again, that's a capital investment that I think is not maybe something we think about until we need it, but spending some time now to think about that. How can we develop some resiliency to our system with a backup electrical, a generator? What could that look like? How could we make that work? That's another investment that I think is worth considering if, that's maybe not part of your system right now, just to, prepare yourself for the worst, hope for the best.
Absolutely. So, Aaron, are there any other categories that you want to touch on before we shift gears in this conversation?
Yeah, so we continue to think about hard assets. Again, I think, being able to buy commodities in bulk, again, depending on your size, if you aren't able to take truckloads of an item, whether that's cake or distiller's grains or, something else, could you develop something that would give you some flexibility to do that? Another one that I think for many ranchers that is one of those it's really nice to have but not necessary would be like just a good quality scale, a good quality livestock scale. Knowing where you're at with the weight of your animals and what they weigh from a marketing standpoint, but just, treating animals, things like that, handling and working facilities. I'm sure you see, Shaye, sometimes, well, we got by again this year and we know we need to get this replaced, but boy, we don't really have the money to do that. A good working facility it just makes the whole day better. And so it makes it better for the people that are working the cattle. It makes it better for the cattle. There's less injury, there's some real positives. So I think making investment there is well worth it too, if there's a need for that.
Well, I will say last summer, Philip and I put in a new tub and alley. And the chute we have works, but we needed a new tub and alley. And it was something we were going to try and maybe push off for another 3 to 5 years. It was not immediate, but something happened and it was a really close call. And we were like, you know what? We're just going to go to town this week. We're going to call the local fencing store and they priced some things out for us and we put one in. And yeah, it's easier on us. It's easier on the cattle.
Well, and I think, the other thing is just for me too, what's your loadout facility? And I'm sure you've seen this, but if we think about the shrink that happens on cattle or the stress that happens to cattle when there's a lot of stress at the loading facility, again, is there a way to improve on that and just minimize, reduce risk? And again, I think we just continue to learn and get better. So, I had the opportunity 25 years ago to get exposed to Bud Williams and get exposed to a Bud box and how that works with loading cattle. And again, that's not for everybody, but, tub and alley, whatever the tool is that will best help you handle cattle safely and, in a stress minimal way. I think those are great investments and a great place to put some profits.
All right. So, maybe we've touched on it a little bit, but, we've seen some good years. And how can we use these good years to cushion ourselves and make the bad years not so bad, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think as we've already talked about a lot of things, try to make investments now that have longer term benefits. And, we've talked about some capital things, making some improvements. One thing we haven't touched on is, maybe you've got some alfalfa seedings or some long-term forage things that need to be renovated. Maybe there's some meadows that could use some legumes or, there's some soil fertility things that you could do now that would have 3-5 year type benefits. So don't overlook making an investment in those. And then circling back to your question here, honestly, Shaye, sometimes one of the best things we can do is pay taxes. And so what I mean by that is that having some cash in hand, because we pay some tax and now I've got some cash, providing a little cushion, to me is prudent. And again, I don't want to pay taxes unnecessarily, but I'm a believer that eventually a profitable business will pay some taxes. Now, that needs to be done strategically. It needs to be done with thought, but having some cash that you can have access to gives you opportunity to take advantage of opportunities when they're presented, I think is an important thing to strategically position yourself and your business to be in a good place going forward. And again, circling back to what we first talked about, I'm also a big believer in investing in yourself and investing in how can I grow my skill set, my knowledge base. Who can I hire? Who can I ask for input who might, again, this is being vulnerable, but might come on my operation and give me a real assessment of where's opportunities, where's some threats, maybe where's some things that I haven't thought about. And this is uncomfortable, but just like you and I drive up and down the road and we look at someone's place and we say, how come they don't see that? Or how come they don't understand what's going on there? Why don't they see that thing that's happening? And it's the same thing for me. When we moved in our current house, there was 3 trash barrels sitting by the garage when we moved in, and 2 years later, they were still sitting there and I just didn't see them anymore. And so we just kind of get used to our environment. We get used to the way things are, and someone else will come in and see something that we don't see. And I think kind of flip a switch for us and say, I had not thought about that, or I've not seen that opportunity. I think that can be a game changer as far as thinking about opportunities for the business going forward. And I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here, but thinking about what other enterprises could potentially complement what's currently on the ranch and maybe exploring some of those with some profits, trying some things out. And so this will stretch some of your listeners here a little bit, but I've had some conversations with some folks recently looking at small ruminants as a complement to their cow-calf enterprise, whether that's some goats or some sheep, or, maybe it's a direct marketing opportunity, or maybe it's looking at something crazy like we live near town. Maybe we could have a pet cemetery on a corner of our property. I mean, some out of the box stuff that we wouldn't normally think about, but could we take some profits right now and explore some enterprises that we would never normally think about, but could complement or strengthen our business portfolio as a whole?
Absolutely. And I think especially for operations who are trying to figure out how to bring another generation back, you want to be creative and keep that open mind when you're looking at what enterprises are going to work or not going to work. And yeah, thanks for bringing all that up.
Yeah. I think the great thing right now is that if I've got some profits, go visit somebody that's already doing it, pick their brain, spend an afternoon with them. You'll learn so much. You'll find out pretty quickly, hey, this is something we're interested in, or wow, nice idea. Don't want to go there.
Well, Aaron, before we move on to our final question today, is there anything else that you want to talk about?
We've covered a lot of things. I think, again, just think about your business plan. If you haven't, sat down, reviewed that yourself with your team, do that. What are some opportunities to do with profits? Again, I know it's a busy time of year. We're in the summer, the days are long, and so we're trying to squeeze every hour of daylight that we can, but maybe spend some tractor time or some windshield time thinking about, if we have a really good year, if things continue to go as they will, what could we do with that? And think creatively beyond, let's buy a tractor or let's buy a new pickup and trailer. Again, maybe needed. Those might be a great place to invest, but is there something else you could do that could position your business to move it forward?
All right. Well, Aaron, to wrap things up, a kind of fun and personal question is, if you could go back to your first 5 years in the beef industry, what would you do differently?
I think I would have invested more in relationships. I think as I get to the place where I'm at in life, I recognize that if relationships fail, everything else fails. And so I think we can work really hard at the business side, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but boy, I would encourage folks who are early on in their career, invest in relationships, whether that's with your spouse or that's with the family, or it's the building some really good friendships, relationships in the industry. Invest in people, because long term, in my mind, that's really going to pay dividends, and not investing in that is going to limit what you're able to do.
All right. What great advice. Folks, if you are listening today and there were any resources, or if you want to connect with Aaron, I will include the links to all of that in the show notes if you heard any of those throughout the show. And remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your other favorite podcasts is to leave a rating and review, and even better, share it with a friend who would find value in the conversation. But with that, happy ranching, folks. Folks, are you ready for more conversations to push your ranch to the next level and keep you thinking about how you can improve as a ranch manager? If you're thinking, heck yeah, then you need to join my free Facebook group, Rising Ranchers, where you can connect and learn from other ranchers and experts, as well as access additional ranching resources. You can find the direct link in the show notes.